All right, guys, with that wrapped up, let's go ahead and get into my segment for the show today. And this is going to be one of those segments where I actually record it both for the podcast and I record it on my phone with a short video for YouTube and for sharing on Facebook and other social media. So if you're seeing it that way, this is part of a podcast. The entire podcast episode is at the Survival Podcast. It's episode 2583, and it's our expert counsel show. And I usually take the anchor position and answer the last question of the day. And this question has come at me as a question that is honest and sincere, and it's come at me as in a form of accusations as well, more on social media than from my audience, who has a more holistic view of what I talk about than people who see it on social media and go, this guy's supposed to be a permaculturist, look what he's doing. He's killing the planet with hydroponics. And that's really what the crux of the question is. Is hydroponics good or bad for the environment? Is it detrimental to the environment? Does it hurt the planet? Is it permaculture? Is it regenerative? All different versions of this question. Well, the other side of that, instead of the questions I get, are the accusations. It's terrible. It's a terrible environmental it causes environmental problems. It's a terrible process. It's bad for the environment. It's horrible. Well, here's a funny thing. You ask those people, explain to me why. Go ahead, explain to me why. And what you generally get is, you're just stupid, or everybody knows, or it doesn't build soil. At least the last one's kind of sort of true. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's bad for the environment. It doesn't mean that it is or it is not regenerative. So let's start out with the concept of regenerative agriculture, which is that group is where most of the anger comes from whenever you talk about anything that's not a grazing system and soil. First of all, I think the best and highest form of agriculture that we can do as a species is savanna mimic grazing systems with animals in it. Absolutely. I also know that we can't do it everywhere, and we damn sure can't do it at scale everywhere, and it is a horrible way to grow lettuce. Which, when we look at hydroponics, the best stuff to grow is tier 1 leaf crops and then tier 2 fruit crops. So we're talking about lettuce and basil and herbs and spinach and kale and anything like that, mustard, etc. Or we're talking about, mid-range annual production from things that are even really perennials, like peppers and tomatoes and eggplants and stuff like that. Okay? Like that is the hydroponic wheelhouse, and most commercial and even home scale, that's what it focuses on. You cannot show me a regenerative lettuce farm. If one exists, I've never seen it. But I can, especially, now you can say, well, Curtis Stone. Curtis is a buddy of mine. And he's doing some really great things with spin farming and backyard farming. And he's growing at scale if you're talking about a scale of a few local restaurants. When I say scale, I mean 60,000 heads of lettuce a month. That's scale. And it's a tiny mouse fart of scale to the amount of lettuce that one city consumes in a month. People do not understand the amount of food necessary to feed the planet, and people eat lettuce, and people eat basil, etc. And we're not talking about having your backyard garden and doing some cut and come again and stuff like that. We're talking about growing the scale to feed people, to feed cities, to feed countries. And that is not ever going to be done on soil in a way that's truly regenerative and practical and profitable. It's not out in an open field. It's going to be some form of greenhouse growing with more controls, especially if we want to minimize two of the biggest things we don't want in our food, pesticides and herbicides. Okay? Fertilizer is fertility in many different forms. We'll get to that in a minute. But I think we all agree pesticides and herbicides are bad. We can minimize pesticides to almost nothing in a hydroponics operation. Occasionally something might need to be done with some soap water or something like that. But we completely eliminate the need for herbicides. Zero. Okay, so right out of the gate, before we even get to the effect on the land or whatever, we've just taken two of the biggest pollutants of humans and ecosystems, and we've eliminated them. Pesticides and herbicides are gone. And even in organic farming, when we're talking about farming at scale, we're talking 100 acres of lettuce in the fertile valleys of California. There is a shitload of insecticide that goes on those fields. It's just organic insecticides. And it's not necessarily good. It's less bad, but it's not necessarily good. So we've eliminated that. That's gone. Now the next thing is, if we're going to do regenerative agriculture, we have to take land that's currently being conventionally farmed, and we need to change how it's being farmed. Now if that land is being used to grow corn, and we turn it into cattle farms, we don't have the corn production. Since I think we overproduce corn, I don't know that it's a big deal, but sooner or later we're still going to grow some corn somewhere. People are going to eat corn, people are going to use corn, people are going to feed corn to animals, etc. It's going to happen. So we're going to have some of that stay there. But whatever we can take and move in those big giant fields in the Midwest are prime places to do savanna mimic grazing systems. I'm all for it. I think it is one of the true ways to help solve the environmental crisis that we're in, created largely by agriculture. But we can't do it growing lettuce, and people are going to eat lettuce and basil, etc. And again, I don't care what you do in your backyard. Not everybody's going to do that, and that's good news for farmers because farmers need people to sell to. So we've eliminated 100% herbicide for any lettuce growing operation. And we've pretty much made the pesticide almost nothing. Let's talk about the next problem with conventional agriculture or organic agriculture growing in fields. Agriculture being the culture of fields, not the culture of plants. That would be horticulture. Gotcha? So, the biggest export the United States has by tonnage is topsoil. Now, we don't export it as we put it on a boat and we sell it to the Germans or the Chinese. We export it in the wind and water, and it goes out to the ocean. It damages our aquatic ecosystems, but it also leaves our land infertile. I don't care if it's organic. The only way that you maintain an organic lettuce farm of, let's say, 100 acres is you're constantly bringing in more organic matter. It's coming from somewhere, and you're still constantly exporting topsoil off that farm. Most organic operations do a better job than most conventional operations at retaining soil, but we're still losing a shit ton of soil, which is going into our rivers and streams and oceans. With a hydroponic system, let's say a greenhouse system to make it one thing that we're talking about here, we have zero soil erosion. So we've gone from lots of soil erosion to no soil erosion. Maybe we're not building soil now, but what we're not doing is losing it. There's no net loss. Now, when we run a hydro operation, we do have some leftover material. We have plant roots, we have growing media. Generally, if it's not organic growing media, I don't mean USDA organic, I mean living thing like cocoa coir or something like that. If it's something like leca, clay pebbles or whatever, if we're growing in that, then if the growing's done, we take it, we clean it, and we put it back in and we keep using it. It's reusable. If it's organic, we compost it. That's what we do with it. That's what happens to it. Or we have some waste product. We harvest our lettuce, and because our customers want a perfect product, we pull a few leaves off. We have a big pile. All of that's compost. So even if the amount of soil in the form of compost that a hydroponic greenhouse is producing is relatively small, it's still a net gain because we've had zero loss. So it's good for the environment in that it's stopping soil loss and maybe is producing some organic soil improvement that can be used somewhere else. Next is energy. It takes a lot of energy to take that head of lettuce from California to Georgia where you buy it at your super friendly market. And that's where most of that kind of produce comes from in the United States, is California. And it is grown all over the United States as well, with all the problems with it, but most of it's coming from California. Most of it in Texas is actually not coming from California. It's coming from West Texas, being grown in greenhouses way out in West Texas, where they're doing more like conventional greenhouse farming instead of hydroponics. That's still pretty far. It's not as bad, it's still pretty far. Anyway, what I'm saying is there's a big fossil fuel need to move your lettuce, your cucumbers, etc. from California to your store where you buy it. Well, if we're doing hydroponic greenhouses, we can grow, and we are doing it right in town. There's big operations right here in Dallas-Fort Worth, in Houston. I've seen a couple down there. Atlanta, Montreal, Canada. I mean, everywhere you go, this is happening more and more. They're taking land. Instead of taking land away that's in wilderness, they're taking urban land and repurposing it, so no new land is being used. They're installing greenhouses, and now that produce is being grown and it's moving tens of miles versus thousands. So now we've reduced the fuel needed to transport the food. We've reduced the time, so we eliminate something else: waste. Of that food that's grown in the fertile valleys of California, 40% of it or more in general never actually gets to a customer. It's discarded along the way because it goes bad. So we're eliminating waste to almost zero, because a well-run hydroponics greenhouse can say, we need 50,000 heads of lettuce this month, and grow exactly 50,000 heads of lettuce to an exact size and know exactly what they're doing and already have it sold and already have it knowing it's only going to move this far. So we take waste down to almost nothing. Is that not good for the planet compared to the alternative when we're talking about the types of plants? We're not talking about, obviously growing chestnuts and apples is better for the planet than growing corn. That's not what we're talking about. We're not going chestnuts and apples or corn with hydroponics. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about growing the nutrient-dense leafy greens and other fruits and vegetables that people actually eat in large numbers and derive nutrient from. So we'll get to nutrient in a second, because I got another environmental concern for you. How about water? Hydroponics, you would think, uses a lot of water because it's hydroponics. It uses about 10% of the water that a field growing lettuce or basil or strawberries or tomatoes would use. 10%. We use 10% less water. We're in a water crisis. Right now they're trying to figure out how to save the Olagala aquifer. There's only one way to save that aquifer. Stop pumping water out of it. That's it. It ain't going to fill up because it rains today. That's fossil water. It's ancient water. It'll take 1,000 lifetimes for it to even begin to fill back up if we fix the land that we've screwed up. Don't you think using 90% less water is a good start to solving the water issues? Now, the water issue goes right into the erosion issue, because even when you're irrigating, all that water is leaching nutrient that, when it does rain, gets washed into our rivers and streams. So those two go together when we look at it holistically. We're cutting our water usage now. Next, the gains over growing in a field. In one study, and I have links in the notes for the show if you go look up the podcast if you're on YouTube or elsewhere, is about 7 times. 7 times. An acre greenhouse running hydroponics can produce about 7 times the produce per annum, per year, that a field can. It does that in multiple ways, but because it grows in more dense, because there's less loss, because the plants get everything they need, so we can plant much tighter together, because we can move things in a greenhouse. Well-run operations, they're planted extremely dense. If my hands are, let's say, an NFT system, and there's rails, and then there's plants planted in these rails, and they're like that, and they move across the greenhouse. They're planted on this side, and they move across to the other side, and then we harvest them, and we know exactly each day what we're harvesting from the other side. Well, as they move across, those rails split apart, and they get further apart as the plants need them to. That's another way we increase our yields. We have no insect loss, or very little insect loss. It's very easy to control in that environment. Healthy plants, and the plants are extremely healthy, have less problems with insects as well. So we have less loss, and we get 7 times. And we get more in some studies, and we get a little less in some. So let's just say it was 5, because five's kind of where it starts. 5 times more productive. All right. So now we take an acre of field, or let's not do an acre. Let's do a 1 acre greenhouse, or we have 5 acres of field. That 5 acres is now available to be farmed in a much more regenerative manner. And if we don't do the greenhouse, we still have to feed those people those crops that they want to consume. And understand that the population of this planet is going to grow by about 2 billion people, whether you like it or not, between now and 2050. Those 2 billion people have to be fed. If we don't figure out how to do more with less, the only alternative is to clear more land, which we all know is not regenerative. It's the exact opposite. It's damaging. So if we want to take these fields and convert them that are currently growing peppers and tomatoes and lettuces and stuff like that, some portion of that production has to go somewhere else. Well, we can move it into urban Detroit. We can move it into the middle of Dallas-Fort Worth. We can move it to Houston. We can move it to Atlanta. We can move it to Tallahassee. We can move it to any urban environment. We can build the greenhouse on top of a 1 acre building, and it gets heat in the winter from the residual heat from the building. They're going to heat anyway. And then we can push our yields to 9 or 10 times what that land out there can do. And now that land can either be allowed to just regrow into the forest that it was, or it can be managed into a savanna mimic, or it can be turned into farm forestry. But that isn't going to happen unless we replace that food production with something. Is this the only way? Is this the way? No. Of course it isn't. And see, I hate anybody's assertion that, well, we're going to save the world with hydroponics. We're going to save the world with aquaponics. We're going to save the world with regenerative agriculture. We're going to save the world with biodynamics. We're going to save the world with permaculture techniques. Bullshit. This is a massive hydra of problems. We don't need to be turning away from valid technologies and valid techniques that address any portion of the problem. And I know what people are going to say, but you could grow the same thing in the ground and then you would be building soil. So do that too. But maybe the best use of a soil-based system is not growing lettuce in the hundreds of acres. Maybe it's planting trees. But do you see a world where humans stop eating leafy greens? And I know some of you gardeners are like, I can't even eat all the greens. It just grows everywhere. That's great for you. Not everybody lives where you live, and not everybody wants to be a gardener. That's why we need farmers. If everybody would grow their own food, right, we're going to have a utopia. It's not happening, folks. We need engineers. They don't have time to grow gardens, not sufficiently to feed their whole family. They have to buy food from you if you're a farmer. That's a good thing. Hydroponics isn't really bad or good. It is a technique. And when used properly, it does a hell of a lot of good. And even if you can't accept the fact that there's some direct good to come from it, what you can say is it absolutely stops butt cold some of our biggest problems. The overuse of irrigation, the overuse of herbicide, the overuse of pesticide, and the erosion of topsoil. It stops all four of those butt cold. If that's not good enough for you, I'm going to make a statement that's going to sound a little bit crazy here for a second, but it kind of parallels racism. Now, I don't mean that politically or ethically or anything like that, but if you think about what racism at its core is I look at a person because their skin color is different than mine, they're bad. Well, that's back to our quote of the day today, that's ignorance. That's an opinion in the medium of ignorance between knowledge and ignorance, right? That's what that is. That's an opinion that's based on ignorance. I've made that determination simply because I don't like the way that person looks for whatever reason, and therefore they must be bad. But I don't know anything about that person at all. I have no knowledge of that person. I've never met that person. For all I know, that person is a much better human being than me, but because they look a certain way, I've made a determination that's negative without doing any research or knowledge or anything. When people say things like hydroponics is bad, that's what they're doing. And I'll give you an example of this. A very well-known kind of garden personality on the radio, I just heard from a listener about this. So I'm watching what you're doing because I'm using hydroponics to do seed starting. So I'm not even growing the plants out in hydro systems for this system. I'm just simply starting my peppers and tomatoes and all my other stuff in a little hydro rack up in an extra room in my house. I take those plants and plant them in my garden. And then they grow out in soil. Yay, we're growing soil. And she said, I'm not going to do it until I see what happens because this guy, and he was well-known associate of Howard Garrett, who I have a lot of respect for, and I don't know what Howard thinks or knows about hydro. This other guy, Mike something or whatever, he said, you can't do it because if you start plants in hydroponics, they won't be strong enough to grow in soil. I'm like, well, I got like 100 of them growing in soil right now, and they're doing just fine. See, that's a person that should know better. But they're making this, again, it's a parallel to the way that people are racist in that since I don't like the way this thing sounds or looks or feels, with no knowledge of it, I'll just say bad things about it, completely based in ignorance. And then the problem is other people hear that, and if the person saying it is someone that is generally seen as kind of smart and informed, well, if he said it, it must be true. I've heard people tell me, you can't even, in a hydroponic or aquaponic system, either one, you don't even get valid seed. Bullshit, I get valid seed. Half the stuff I plant is from seed that's produced by plants that I let go to seed in aquaponic systems because I've been doing that a lot longer than hydro. These are two statements that are demonstrably false, but people believe them because they basically have a bias against something because they don't like it. I'm not telling you to embrace and love and start doing hydroponics. I'm saying if you're going to express your opinion about something, please become informed about it. Because I thought this way too. Because here's my last myth about hydro systems for you today. They're sterile. There's no way they're nutrient-dense food because they're sterile. There's no bacteria. There's no fungi. They're sterile. It's hydroponics. It's just man-made chemicals in water. Really? Because see, I believed that like 10 years ago. And I said that on the air, and a guy took me to task for it. And being someone who doesn't mind having my ignorance cured by anybody, I said, well, how do you know? And there wasn't a lot of the research that I can point you to today that just says you're wrong, right? Science just tests it and goes, here it is. There's all these, beneficial bacteria and fungi colonies in hydro systems, and there is. It makes perfect sense to me after doing aquaponics for 5 years, because that's how we build it. The whole thing's built on bacteria and fungi. Okay, that's how it all works. So why wouldn't it be in a hydro system too? But he did something really, really simple to shut me down and shut me up and get me to open my mind. He sent me a picture of hydroponically grown peas. Do you know he sent me a picture of the roots? And the roots were covered with more nitrogen-fixing bacteria nodules than I've ever seen from a pea plant in the ground. And he said, I'm using synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer. Now, I actually use a hydroponics fertilizer that's largely derived from organic product. But he had bacteria like I've never seen before. You can't get those nodules on a legume without the bacteria because the legume doesn't fix nitrogen. The legume doesn't do it. The bacteria that forms a symbiotic relationship and attaches itself to the root does. So how the hell can you have a nitrogen-fixing bacteria existing in a system that's devoid of any beneficial bacteria? So it doesn't work. So then I've done some of the reading now of research to cure your ignorance, to actually become informed. And I found that the amount of bacteria and fungi in most hydroponic systems that are well-run is right in line with well-run soil-based organic farms. Right in line. I mean, right in the median. And it far exceeds conventional farms, where the soil largely is devoid of beneficial bacteria and fungi, because it's an inhospitable environment. But let me ask you a question. Could you think of a place on the planet where you create an environment that's conducive to the life that is fungi and bacteria, that fungi and bacteria don't show up? And the answer is no. You can't keep it out unless you have a clean room. So of course, it just makes perfect sense. I have links to my claims about production levels, scientific studies. I have links to articles that explain the bacteria and fungi in the show notes today. If you're seeing this elsewhere, you can go look it up. I'll have a link to this episode again, 2583. Those of you that are listening to my podcast on the air, I probably have to push less hard on you because you've listened to me over the years about this. But hydroponics is not bad for planet Earth. It's good for planet Earth. Is it directly regenerative? I would have to say overall, not directly. Indirectly, I think it's highly regenerative because it's producing nutrient-dense food, and people that eat nutrient-dense food produce nutrient-dense waste instead of the garbage, pesticide, herbicide-laden waste we're putting in our sewer systems today that end up in our water systems. And additionally, it's freeing up land that can be then farmed in a more regenerative way. But it's certainly not harmful, and it certainly is a net gain for environmentalism. As far as is it permaculture? Well, it doesn't harm the earth. It doesn't harm people. In fact, I would tell you it prevents the abuse of people. Because you want to see abuse? Go to Baja, California and look at organically farmed lettuce and carrots and see the abuse of human beings in their labor. So it reduces the abuse of human beings. Does it return surplus? I think the thing about hydroponics is it doesn't have a huge surplus to return. It has a surplus in a harvest, and it distributes that surplus, but there's not a lot to recycle. About the only thing you end up with eventually, you have to change out the fluid, and as long as that's used responsibly, it can just be used to fertilize lawns, perennials, vegetables, whatever. It's not a toxin. It is totally safe to use. So that surplus can be returned if you have a greenhouse operation in your backyard. Most of us that do hydroponics, by the way, we garden, we farm, we do other things in soil. We take that, we might even dilute it a little bit, and we pour it into our gardens, and our plants grow better. And in my case, again, I'm using a organically derived fertilizer in my systems anyway. So it's still organic. And then we have kind of the waste product, which can be composted. So the little surplus there is that doesn't go away to customers or get consumed by people is returned. Does it take follow Prime Directive, take responsibility for that of ourselves and that of our children? I say it does. So I say it falls in line with permaculture principles and ethics. I don't see any reason not to do it. And I don't see any reason to do it if you don't want to. But please stop talking shit, some of y'all, about things that you just don't understand.